I'm humbled to be with you today, members of the Baptist Alliance, for this virtual gathering. And I certainly want to thank God for my dear sister, and I mean that in all of whatever that word sister means in so many dimensions, Nancy Petty, and to all of you who are my friends in the Alliance. Today, because of the time, I want to go right at the text. It's found in Hebrews chapter 10. The last verses of Hebrews chapter 10. And it says, we are not of those who shrink back unto destruction, but we are those who persevere unto the salvation of the soul. And the next verse in Hebrews 11 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I want to suggest today that if we know who we are, we cannot shrink back now. If we know who we are, we cannot shrink back now. The purpose and the power that we have demands, as Dr. King once said, in fact, he said it the night that he was suspicious that he might not live but a few more days, and he did not live another day. But that last speech, he said, nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. I want to come back to that exegesis of that text a little later, but I'm glad to be with all of you. I want to ask you to write down www.poorpeoplescampaign.org, www.poorpeoplescampaign.org. I'm a little strange on these technical things, so if you can hear me, just put a thumb up. Just make sure you hear me well. It's not echo. Good. Thank you. My rabbi friends have taught me something, and that is that the word for voice and the word for vote are the same words in Hebrew. Kol, K-U-L. And many times when it says the voice of God thundered, it means you could be and said the vote of God. God decided. And sometimes when it says, and they declared what the Lord said, the voice of the Lord, it means it's called, K-U-L. Vote and voice are the same words. There's no need to run around it. I could not come before you today and preach and act as though that is not an issue we need to wrestle with, so let's wrestle with it. Voting is indeed power unleashed. And I believe in this moment we see something happening. In South Africa, as they moved towards the ending of apartheid, one person said that the closer they came to the citizenship and voting, the worse things became, the more the extremists began to act out. And they developed a saying that only a dying mule kicks the hardest. Only a dying mule kicks the hardest. That a lot of times what we see when extremists know that their end of reign of power is coming unloosed, they will begin to act out just as a dying mule does. Here we are, and I want to talk about power. Sometimes as Christians, we talk about love, we talk about justice, as we should, but I want to talk some about power. Because justice without love can be vengeful, hurtful, but love without power is weak and anemic. There's a song that's entitled, I think actually, Nancy, it ought to be a hymn in the church, really. It's not, we don't sing it as a hymn in the church. It was written by a guy named Hoosier in tribute to Nina Simone. And its title of the song is, It's Not the Waking, It's the Rising. Listen to it for a moment. It says, it's not the waking, it's the rising. It's the grounding of a foot uncompromising. It's not for the foregoing of the lie. It's not the opening of the eyes. It's not the waking, it's the rising. It's not the heaven of the human spirit ring. It's the heaven of the human spirit ringing. It's the bringing of the line. It's the bearing of the lie. It's not the waking, it's the rising. And I could cry, power. The song suggests that being awoke is not enough. The truth of the matter is you can be awoke and still be in bed. The songwriter says it's not just waking, it's rising. And when we talk about voting power, seemingly we often talk about it from the standpoint that extremists have all this power, or at least most of it. And one of the things we have to do is demythologize this. There's some things we need to clear up. We need to clear up. We need to know who we are. We are not of those who shrink back. Right now, if everybody that has been rejected and reviled by regressive public policy would participate in this democracy, we have the power to shape it. In this season of voting and so much sin, can I use that word at the Baptist Alliance? Sin, trying to suppress the vote. We need to know what power we have. And I say sin because voting is a theological issue, not just a political issue. I've already said that in Hebrew, the word for vote and voice is call. But I also want us to know that it's a theological issue because in America, we don't give the right to vote to puppies, parakeets, and pets. We only give the right to vote to those who are 18 years and old or older, born or naturalized in these United States of America. Which means then, if someone attempts to suppress your vote in any way, and we only give the right of the vote to persons 18 years or older, born or naturalized in these United States, then that suppression is suggesting that you are not a person. That suppression is saying that someone has the right to diminish the imago Dei in all of us. Voter suppression is idolatry. It is a form of political self-worship. To possess, you have the power to keep others' call, voice, and vote from being expressed. And so the church cannot be quiet on that matter, because to suppress our vote is to politically sin and try to diminish my personhood. I believe we must approach voting from this standpoint and know what happens then if we do more. We know what extremists are doing. We know what racists are doing. We know what those who are greedy are doing. But what would happen if we do more? Mobilizing, organizing, registering, educating people for the movement who vote. What if we use what God said to Moses? God said to Moses, "What's in your hand?" In essence, God was saying, Moses, look, do you know who you are? I know Pharaoh. Okay. But what's in your hand? What could happen if we engage this democracy? And so I want to do what Rabbi Heschel once said, the role of the prophet or the prophetic movements are, and that is to break us free from all of the false narratives that we have tended to give our allegiance to, so that we can understand and have a deeper prophetic and political imagination. Remember now, it's not the waking, it's the rising. Remember now, we are not of those who shrink back unto destruction. We cannot be those who know there is a problem with our society and we still do not engage. Coretta Scott King put it like this one time when she was asked about the death of her husband at the hands of a murderer. What is violence, Coretta? And Coretta said, well, Violence is not just the murder of my husband with a deer rifle. Violence is denying a child education. Violence is denying wages and union rights and health care. Violence is stripping people of their culture. And then she said, but an apathetic attitude that refuses to address these other forms of violence is in itself also violent. We in the church must decide in every age we are going to be on the side of nonviolence. And nonviolence never means non-action. It means action rooted in deep love, deep truth, rooted in the power that God gives us, the weapons of our warfare, which are not carnal, that always has an internal disdain for domination and empire. We have power. So let us first be clear, Baptist Alliance. There's so much power available when it comes to engaging this democracy that we should never start from the perspective that people who believe in truth and love and justice, that people who know that nations will be judged by how it treats the poor, the hungry, and the least of these, and the homeless and the immigrant, we should never think that we don't have power to transform this democracy. For instance, when we look at the polls, oftentimes on TV, we see numbers, and I often say we need Holy Spirit discernment so we really understand what we're seeing. Sometimes the polls, and you look at CNN, MSNBC, you'll hear them say 70% of these people voted for this candidate. Or they'll say this person is leading by such and such a margin. The truth of the matter is many times those numbers are talking about those who voted, not those who could have voted. Even when they say such and such a person is leading by these numbers, they're talking about what they call most likely voters. They're not talking about the voters that could be organized, the voters in our pews, the voters in our communities, the poor and the low wealth. They're not even just discussing that. They're not talking about those who would have voted if they could have gotten off their job, or if they had transportation provided by a church, or if they had a community of people to make sure they understood about absentee ballot, or if there wasn't voter suppression. And they're surely not talking about the number of people who just don't vote because they never hear politicians talk about poverty and low wealth. The very people that Jesus said the nation will be judged by. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about that, and why the church must get involved, and we must organize poor and low wealth people on their own accord? Because the very thing that Jesus says nations will be judged by are the very things you never hear in political debates, primary debates, general debate. You never hear the debate tomorrow night is going to be on how your candidate is going to deal with the homeless, or the hungry, or the sick, or the immigrant. For the most part, it's just the middle class and the wealthy. And so we got to be clear that the numbers we see are not the numbers that are possible. Let me show you what I mean. We commissioned a study because, prophetic prophets have to study, y'all. They just don't get up and say, tomorrow you're going to get a car. That's not a prophet. That's a fool. The prophets of the Bible were among the most erudite, studious persons of the culture. And prophetic movements and prophetic churches have to not only be loud, we sound the trumpet, we have to be right. Because the worst thing to do is be loud and wrong. So we commissioned a study with a professor from Columbia University. We said, what is really the power of poor and low wealth people? And in that study, it revealed something. The study is called Unleashing the Power of Poor and Low Wealth Folk. And it says what we can do right now, what every one of your churches can do right now. First, it revealed to us that 100 million people who were eligible to vote didn't vote in the last election. I want you to hear that for a moment. We have never seen the full working of this democracy. 100 million people. That's power. And if we talk about winning and losing, we have to qualify the last election where the current occupant of the White House won by the Electoral College, but did not win the popular vote by millions of voters. And let me note that, because since 1876, this has happened at least 3 other times in American history, or at least 2 other times in American history. And every time someone sits in the White House that wins the Electoral College and loses the popular vote, it has turned out bad. Let's look a little bit deeper. We have a reality in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, Michigan, and in Pennsylvania. The presidential election last time was determined by less than 80,000 votes. Less than 80,000 votes secured the 270 Electoral College votes. But what is often not talked about, this is what I mean by demythalization of the current reality of politics, is that in those same 3 states, 2.1 plus million poor and low wealth people who could have voted didn't vote. And politicians, for the most part, did not speak to them, talk to them. You know, the truth of the matter is, and I hate to say it, but I have to as a pastor, sometimes you can go to church and never hear a message about the poor, about the stranger, about the immigrant, about the homeless, even though that's the dominant theme of Scripture. If you know, the Poverty and Justice Bible shows us that if you cut every scripture out in the Bible that talks about justice and how we treat the poor and the least of these, the Bible would literally fall apart. And yet, that's not the main discussion in our politics, but too often not even in our pulpit. And yet, that's where the power is. The power, you all, is in the valley of dry bones. The power in this country, we have power. Let me show you what I mean. We found out that there were 64 million poor and low wealth voters in 2016. That means that poor and low wealth voters now make up nearly 30% of the electorate, nearly 1/3 of the entire electorate. Now, of that 63 million, 29 million voted. 34 million did not vote who were already eligible to vote. And the studies show it's not they didn't vote because they're apathetic. The studies show that they didn't vote because our nation's politics are apathetic about poverty and the poor, and sometimes even our pulpit. In fact of the matter, the study went on to show that in 2016, because of a New York Times article, it reported that for those making under $50,000 a year, they voted for the candidate at the top of the ticket that had the more progressive agenda by 10%. So poor and low wealth people actually vote for their lives, vote for a more just agenda, but it's the volume. And many times the volume is not high because they don't hear themselves discussed in the public arena, because they cannot get off work, because they don't have transportation, and because of voter suppression. In fact, if I go further in our study, we found that 15 plus states, even in the South, poor and low wealth people voting at the same rate as those with higher incomes would exceed the margin of victory in 2016 presidential elections and Senate races. Let me name them. You may have never heard this on the TV. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Arizona, Minnesota, Maine, Florida, New Mexico, North Carolina, Nevada, Georgia, Texas, Mississippi, Ohio. Poor and low wealth people hold the power. We are not of those who shrink back under destruction. They hold the power to transform elections from the governor's race to the Senate race to the White House. And 1/3 of all poor people live in the South, and 1/3 of all white people live in the South. And there are 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country prior to COVID. I'll come back to that in a minute. In all of these states I just named, change is possible if just between 1 and 19% of poor and low wealth people, notice 1 and 19% vote this time who did not vote last time. Not 20%, not 30%, not 40%, not 40%, just 1 to 19%. And if you add a few other states, it's just between 1 and 29%. In Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Arizona, Minnesota, Maine, Florida, New Mexico, North Carolina, Nevada, Georgia, Texas, Mississippi. In fact, in North Carolina, where Nancy and I are, 970,000 poor and low wealth people were not talked to. 970,000 poor and low wealth people did not vote in the last election. Only 19, if just 19% of those vote this time, they could close the margin of victory that existed in the presidential race in North Carolina. And if just 10%, 9% of all of the people who didn't vote last time were to vote, and these are conservative estimates. Our report assumes that everyone else votes the same way. But what we know is that if poor and low income people are voting, and voting if their issues and their concerns about health and economic well-being are on the agenda, if voter suppression is overturned, if politicians talk about racism, systemic racism, and how it ends up hurting all people, that will drive voters out, poor and low wealth people, those among the 140 million poor and low wealth before COVID, now closer to 50% of this nation are poor and low wealth after COVID. And the key is, if they vote, they break open the South. Galvanizing poor and low income voters isn't an act of charity. It is, in fact, what can save this democracy and our nation from falling further into crisis. God has fixed it so that the stones that the builders have rejected now hold the key to a new cornerstone in this nation. The truth is, the majority of the people right now who are holding up the stimulus plan, the majority of the people that in the first stimulus demanded that 83% of that money went to banks and corporations, not to the sick and those without sick leave and unemployment and those that needed higher wages. Most of them could be removed if poor and low wealth people and their moral allies and advocates would mobilize and vote. That's why in the Poor People's Campaign, we are intentional now, and we invite you to join in bringing people together across all races, across geographic lines. We like to call it, in Kentucky, from the hood to the holler, from Alabama to Appalachia, from Maine to Mississippi, from California to Carolinas, from the Apache Nation in Arizona to fast food workers in Missouri. Because when we come together, it is power unleashed. And what we are now saying is to poor and low wealth people, don't wait for them to call your name anymore. Don't sit home anymore. Make them hear you. We must do more. Time out for mourning and praying that they will hear our name. The bones in the valley must rise. We are not of those who can shrink back under destruction. Let me go a little bit further on this matter. Did you know that from Maryland to Texas, there are 193 electoral college votes in the South alone, the least populous states? The states that are not red states, but many times unorganized states, the states where so much has been done to keep poor and low wealth people from moving together. That's why in the Poor People's Campaign, we've now organized over 5,000 people who are calling over 1 million voters, poor and low wealth people that did not vote, texting them, pushing them in 8 states. 193 electoral college votes are in from Maryland to Texas. Watch this now. That means anybody that locks up Maryland to Texas only needs 77 electoral college votes from the other 35 states to get to 270. But these are also the same states where 1/3 of all poor people live, and where a small percentage of all poor people organized and voting can fundamentally change the outcome in the elections, the state legislatures, Congress, presidency, Senate. These states are not red states. They are unorganized states. They are states where people have been deliberately divided for years. We also know about these same states that since 2010, in all those states from Maryland to Texas, they have passed racist voter suppression law. You do not pass a racist voter suppression law if you think you can win in a fair fight. The only reason a politician seeks to suppress the vote is because they know what sometimes we don't know, that we have the power They know we have the power. Question is, do we know it? In fact, the same states that have engaged in voter suppression have caused people to get elected, who once they get elected, they block living wages, they block health care. In fact, this is a message we have to get out. Those politicians that do voter suppression use voter suppression and target it at black people and brown people and indigenous people. But here's the ugly reality of racism. Once they get elected, they pass policies that hurt mostly white people. So voter suppression can't just be a black folk issue, a brown people's issue, an indigenous issue. Racism is the threat not just to black people, but to our democracy. And racism is, yes, police brutality, but so much more. In fact, the majority of the people that die from racism don't die from police brutality. They die from the lack of health care. They die from the lack of living wages. They die from poverty. They die from environmental devastation, much of which will never be filmed on a cell phone. So we have to unpack this, and we have to show people how these interlocking injustices of systemic racism and systemic poverty and ecological devastation and the war economy and the false moral narrative of white evangelicalism and white nationalism all connect, and why we can't engage them separately. Black folk can't do it alone. White people can't do it alone. Gay people can't do it alone. Southern folk can't do it alone. Brown people can't do it alone. We must know who we are and who we have to be in this moment. We don't have to accept it, y'all. We have power. We are not of those who shrink back under destruction. That's why I wanted to start here, not with what we don't have, not with what they have done, not with what bad policies, not with what Trump is doing, but with the power that we have. As I began, I said, it's not the waking, it's the rising. It's the rising because it's time to get our heads up and straighten up our backs and go to work. It's time to stop believing the hype about the political races in our country. It's time to stop looking at CNN and MSNBC and the polls and organize people. Organize people where our power can be unleashed. If poor and low wealth persons and their moral allies vote, we can address systemic racism and poverty and ecological devastation. These are not pipe dreams. This is rooted in deep empirical data. Sometimes data that we never hear, and so we stop believing the mythology. We must see this national election as a national emergency. We're facing a serious identity crisis. America's got to decide who she's going to be. Now, that's not new for America, because the truth is America has had a kind of split personality at times. It goes through kind of political social schizophrenia, a great gulf between what she dreams to be and what she is in reality, what she says on paper and what she does in practice. One of our great hymns says this. I'm not saying it because I'm anti-American. I'm saying it because I'm very patriotic. I'm saying it because our patriotic hymns say it. One of them, the second verse, America, America, God, mend thine every flaw. That's what the hymn says. The hymn writer recognized that America is a flawed experiment. Dr. King once critiqued this nation. He loved America so much that he said, let us be dissatisfied until America no longer has a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds. Anemia of deeds. Yes, there's been progress. But this has only come when those of us who knew who we are, because you can't help a nation with tendencies towards schizophrenia if you don't know who you are. It's kind of hard to help insanity if you're insane yourself. If you don't know and not sure about who you are. And there comes a time, and it's been often in history, when those who knew who they are dared to challenge this country and not to give up. We have a nation that has great potential and has at times done some great things, but also has deep and great struggles. In 1965, when white Dixiecrats were fighting the passage of the Voting Rights Act, they were sowing fear and division. Many folk asked why. They asked Dr. King why. And Dr. King knew who he was and who this nation was. And when they finally got to Montgomery, standing on the steps of the Alabama State House, he spoke some words that I think should never be forgotten. And some people believe this was his greatest speech, even greater than the March on Washington, because the March on Washington, people remember the ending, I Have a Dream. They don't really look at what the speech was. The title of the speech was Normalcy No Longer. That was the title of the speech. I Have a Dream was the closing. Most people miss what went on before he got to the closing and the nightmare that he laid out. But when he got to Montgomery, he began to lay out why voting rights was being fought theologically, historically, sociologically. And he decided that day to lay the case out hard. And you ought to read it. People were asking, why is all this opposition? And Dr. King diagnosed it. And he said, it's an identity crisis. This is what he said, part of what he said. He said, it may be said of the slavery era that the white man took the world and gave the Negro Jesus. Then it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy, the Bourbon class, the wealthy class, took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. He gave him Jim Crow, and when his wrinkled stomach cried out for food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man better than a black man. And he ate Jim Crow, and when his undernourished children cried out for necessities that his low wages could not provide, he showed them Jim Crow signs on the buses and on the stores and on the streets and in the public buildings. And his children learned to feed upon Jim Crow, the last outpost of psychological oblivion. Then watch this, Dr. King says, and that's what happens, and what happened when Negro and white masses of the South, poor white masses, threatened to unite and build a great society, a society of justice where none would prey upon the weakness of the others, a society of plenty where greed and poverty would be done away with, a society of brotherhood where every man would respect the dignity and the worth of human personality. This is what happened. The division happened to keep that reality from coming to pass. Because the aristocracy, the racist aristocracy, knew that if poor and low wealth white people in the South, and then add to that Latino and brown people and indigenous, but specifically poor and low wealth white people, found themselves together and worked together to build a great society and exercise their voting power, then extremism could not exist. I stopped by today to tell you that Dr. King's diagnosis can help us understand the identity crisis we face today. We are in a crisis today, and listen, it was premeditated. It is not an accident. The worst thing you can do is blame this simply on one person. The worst thing you can do is say, this is just about Trump. Every day you see there are many parts to this, many layers to this, many people who are engaged in this. There are many forces behind this that we see and some that we don't see. And it didn't just start in 2016. What we are seeing is an experiment with what was called positive polarization. Let me teach for a moment. Is positive polarization an experiment that has gone out of control and created political Frankenstein? In 1968, after George Wallace ran for president and got shot, but he ran on racism, and then Barry Goldwater ran and he could not win. Nixon won, and when he had won, Pat Buchanan and Kevin Phillips wrote him a little memo. And the memo was about positive polarization. And they said, if we want to win and control power and control the money, this is how we do it. We find out who hates who, and we exploit it. We exploit it. Now, we don't exploit it openly with words like nigger and stuff like that. We use other terms like tax cuts and entitlements and forced busing And then later on, we moved to hatred toward gay people. And we moved to being against abortion. But we exploited. Some want us to believe that the responsibility of what's going on now rests solely on the shoulders of one man in the White House. But we must not miss the deeper identity crisis that's being exposed in America, from the State House to the Senate chambers, to the Congress, to the West Wing. How Trump was selected and what was set up for this crisis. The current president is not acting alone. Congressional extremists in his party who've been unwilling to stand up to the president for 3 years created the conditions of this present crisis. This crisis started in our state houses, and all along the way, Trump's white evangelical boosters have offered their blessings, reassuring an influential minority of people that it is a matter of religious faith to stand by this president. Some of them even called him Osiris, the foreign king in the Old Testament that delivered the people of Israel. That somehow he's redeeming America, reclaiming our identity, making America great again. The language actually comes out of the resistance to the first Reconstruction in the 1800s, when the so-called redemptive movement said they needed to make America great again. That meant undermining the allegiances and the working together of Black and white people in the South. But it's not just this. Even among those who claim to be progressive, too often they have anchored themselves in neoliberal consensus. Too often not willing to discuss poverty, but only the issues of middle class and wealthy, afraid to deal with the issues of poverty. And so Princeton historian Nell Painter has said that we see with Trumpism, it's not Trump himself, but it's entire cohort of extremism. She says it's symptomatic of an often recurring iconography in the American story, the schizophrenia. She said we come to our senses for a moment as a nation, and then after we come to our senses, we have a massive, mean, and regressive relapse, a backlash against progress. And what we are seeing is not just the problem of a person, because whatever the state of Donald Trump's mental illness is, 60 million Americans were willing to entrust him with our government. 40% are still willing to trust him today. So this moment is not about whether a party is possible, but whether America is possible. We are, in fact, in the birth pains of a third Reconstruction, a political Pentecost. And America needs more than just a new president and a Senate. We need a moral revival. And we must know, as people of faith, the power to do this is in the hands of the poor, in the hands of the low wealth, and their moral allies and their advocates. And we cannot be quiet. We cannot shrink back. The power is in the hands of those that know what Isaiah 10 said: woe unto a nation, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. The power is literally in the hands of those who understand that Jesus' first words in ministry was, I've come to preach good news to the poor. We must know that in the 21st century, racism and economic fear still too often conjure up a powerful magic which compels this nation to seek safety in hating the other and securing a security in the false nativism that has failed us before and will fail us again. We who know a country cannot survive properly with an impoverished democracy, we must know now is the time that we cannot shrink back. We must call it out and we must vote it out. And the only way is through moral fusion organizing, where the rejected come together and the rejected become the powerful chief cornerstone in building a new society. In fact, if I might, as I close, in 1967, Dr. King gave a prophecy. I believe in many ways he was shocked because of the prophecy, because the prophecy was on target. He said, and he committed himself and others, welfare rights workers, Cesar Chavez and others, because they figured something out. The only group that could force the massive restructuring of American society could be Black, poor whites, Latinos, indigenous, working class people, and union people, and recipients of welfare. They were the only coalition that could shift America's economic architecture and make the profound changes necessary to care for all the people. And in this moment, with all of this craziness, with this dead mute, dying mute kicking, it's because that prophecy can now be fulfilled. We have the power. Can I go back to the text and exegete it, and I'm through? When Paul wrote this, if it was Paul, some say it wasn't, but if it was Paul, he wrote it to the Hebrews church. And they were thinking, there was a group in the church thinking about quitting. There's another thinking about going back. Because Nero was crazy. The emperor on the throne was crazy. He only cared about putting his name on everything he could. He had control of the Senate. He had control of the courts. He had control of the media. He had the control of the sheriffs and the police force. He was crazy. And the folk were kind of tired. And they said, if we just care about ourselves and shrink back, then we don't have to deal with all of this. And it was into that text, into that moment, that the writer says, the just shall live by faith. And faith is not an inactive stance where you just sit back and wait for God to do something. No, faith is an active. Faith without works is dead. Faith is active. And then he says to them, look, Nero is crazy. Nero is out of his mind. But when others are out of their mind, you must have your right mind. Now, let me tell you who we are. The writer says, we followed the one who went through crazy to the point of crucifixion and died, but got up on a Sunday morning. That's who we follow. So understand, we were born for this. We are not of those who, we are not of those who shrink back under destruction, but we are those who persevere unto the salvation of the soul. You know, these words became what oftentimes my daddy told me, that what the civil rights workers would say when their houses were burning down or they had been bombed. They would stand outside of it and look at it with tears in their eyes. But then they would also say, we are not of those who shrink back under destruction. I've heard that this was what one of the great scriptures that Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and others quoted when they face stuff much worse than what we are facing. We are not of those who shrink back under destruction. Langston Hughes didn't quote these words exactly, but in 1935, when there were riots in the street and there was a Great Depression and there was a president who was crippled named Roosevelt, and there were these extremists trying to turn back Social Security and the New Deal. They called it socialism. They called it communism. Langston Hughes wrote in that moment in Harlem something that sounds similar to this. Oh, let America be America again. The land that never has been yet, and yet must be a land where every man is free. The land that's mine's, the poor man's, the Indians, Negroes, me. Who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain from those who live like leeches on the people's lives. We must take back our land again. America, oh yes, I say it plain. America has never been America to me, and yet I swear this oath that America will be. Out of the rack and the ruin of our gangster death, the rape and the rot of graft, the stealth and lies, we the people must redeem the lands, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain, all the stretch of these great green states, and make America again. Yes, I say it plain. America has never been fully America to me, but I swear this oath that America must be. My brothers and sisters, if we know who we are, we cannot shrink back. Not now, not even in the face of COVID, not now, this year. Unleashing the power of poor low wealth people is the same as swearing an oath that America will be. It is the same thing of saying we will not shrink back. We cannot go into next year with what we're dealing with this year, because it's bad now. It will be catastrophic in the future. We must have a psychic and a psychological and a political break. And we have the power. And it's time for a rising that says we will be a country that eradicates systemic racism in every manifestation against Black, brown, and indigenous people rather than embrace systemic racism. We will be a country that alleviates poverty rather than entrenches poverty. We will be a country that ensures health care for all rather than eviscerating health care for most. We will be a nation that envisions and does save the environment rather than ensuring the destruction of the environment. We will be a nation that ends the outlandish investment in the war economy rather than increasing the investment in the war economy. And we will be a nation that engages a moral vision of love and justice and truth rather than follow the enticements of religious nationalism and a distorted moral vision. And why will we be that? Because strangely, God has now given us the power to do it. Not just optimism, but power. The power is such that if we know who we are and we choose not to shrink back, we can shift the direction of this nation. And at the ballot box this year, our voice and our vote will be heard, not just this year, but centuries later. People will hear that when it was our time, when it was our Edmonds Pettus Bridge moment, we didn't shrink back. We stood up. We persevered. We used our power. We held on to love. And we changed the nation and the world for the better. God help us to know who we are.